the license has to be distributable. In other words, I have to be able to give that license to someone, and that license then should work if that someone gives it to yet a third person. The license can't be specific to a product. In other words, if I distribute my software on a Red Hat system, the license can't say you can't distribute this on a SUSE or a Debian system. The license can't contaminate other software. So if I distribute this on a CD with another program, it can't say that other program must be free, otherwise you can't distribute my software. And then the only other part of the open source definition is a list of licenses that were accepted. And the ones that we started with were the GPL, which was actually the example for a lot of what's in the open source definition, the BSD license, because software for BSD system pre-existed Linux.
I think the next moment that I thought was really pivotal was when the database vendors flipped over, which happened about 3 months sooner than I expected it to. It actually happened in late July, early August. That
Who were they?
Commitments to do Tier 1 ports from Oracle and Sybase and the other key database vendors.
And why was that critical?
Because we knew that in order for the open source story to be credible, and especially in order for the Linux story to be credible, we'd have to get commitments from independent software vendors to do ports of their applications to these platforms. And I was actually kind of worried. I felt that we were in a window of vulnerability between the time that we announced the open source campaign and the database vendors flipped over. That was the point at which hostile action by Microsoft or other closed source software companies, that was the point at which a serious marketing blitz might actually have sunk us. But once the big database vendors flipped over, that opened the way for other ISVs. That started a snowball effect going.
Every 6 months or so, I would come back to the venture capitalists, and I would show them the new numbers, showing more and more people adopting Linux, the new people porting, new users, and I'd show them our customer list. And our customer list was getting much more impressive. It was people like Cisco that were beginning to appear. People like the .com companies were starting to show up on our customer list. And eventually the venture capitalists, they kept looking at it and they kept saying, oh, we can't quite do it. Finally, Linus appeared on the cover of Fortune because there was something happening with open source. Well, at that point, the venture capitalists couldn't ignore it. They just got sick of hearing about Linux everywhere, and they got tired of me just showing it to them every at that point almost every week. So they decided it was time to invest, that there was something happening.
Well, I announced open source to the world on the internet. I did a lot of the early administrative work of starting the open source initiative. And I think 6 months later, I was reading the words open source in the news all the time and was totally astounded. And a year later, I believe Microsoft was talking about releasing some source code. And someone in the press asked Steve Ballmer if they were going to open source their code, and Steve Ballmer said, well, open source means more than just releasing the source code. And I realized that he had read my document and understood it and was now telling the press about this. Now, if you're like just a guy on the net who's not doing this for a job at all, and you sort of write a manifesto and it spreads out through the world, and a year later the vice president of Microsoft is talking about that, you'd think you were on drugs, wouldn't you? But that's what really happened.
The local user groups tend to be more an issue of building a social network, especially getting people familiarized with the issues, also just acting as a kind of support network for people who do not, for example, have the ability to pay for a commercial support network. So one thing they're doing in this area, for example, is they're making these, I think it's once a month, they're having install fests, which means that people who have problems getting Linux installed on their machine, or have some issue. I mean, maybe they've actually installed Linux but want to set up the network in a specific way, can actually bring in their machines to this users group meeting. And there's a lot of people that are willing to help who've maybe seen that problem before.
Well, actually, things aren't going so well. I tried it earlier myself. I had problems, and so I came to this Install Fest where all the gurus abound. Hopefully, I'll have better luck getting it in.
Instead of sending emails or writing to news groups on the internet and waiting several days for the answer sometimes, it's easy to come here and find other people who might know about your problem and may be able to help you. And hopefully within a few hours you have your machine installed.
Originally I wanted to install on my larger laptop, and so I just did a search on the net and found where there were resources to get help. And I'm here today because I'm trying to put Linux on this little guy right here, which is a Toshiba Libretto. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do because it's a weird piece of hardware. So, any chairs around here?
I think the Department of Justice case has made people aware of the fact that you should at least look for alternatives to Microsoft, and maybe Microsoft isn't the American dream after all. And that kind of shift in perception, you can very clearly see that people just took Microsoft for granted. And maybe they're still buying Microsoft, but at least they're kind of more aware of the issue these days.
Microsoft actually used Linux as defense. They used Linux to ground a claim that they don't have a monopoly because Linux could essentially push them off their catbird seat at any time. It was a very ingenious argument, totally specious, because it didn't do anything to answer the charge that they had previously engaged in bullying and various anti-competitive practices. But it was clever of them. In an event, the judge didn't buy it.
Well, ordinarily, we in the Linux community are rather wary about letting Microsoft become the issue, but there was a Slashdot article about December of '98 where a fellow named Matt at the Noodle had pointed out that a gentleman in Australia had managed to receive a refund for the unused copy of Windows that came with his computer. So he declared the 19th of January, was it January?
No, it's February.
It's February, I'm sorry. The 19th of February, he declared the 19th of February Windows Refund Day, and he encouraged everyone to go to their computer manufacturers and return their unused copies of Windows as it was specified in the Windows End User License Agreement.
Yeah, it's important to remember that in the license itself it says that you can receive a refund if you don't use the software, and that the manufacturer is bound by law to do this, or at least bound by contract. And we found that, you know, if you called up these manufacturers, they basically said, "It stopped bothering me, kid," and hung up on you. We didn't really want to sort of give out the location of where we were going to meet until, you know, at the very last second. So what we did is we had people meet at places that we could control in the different towns around here. So I was the San Jose marshal, and I believe, Nick, you were the San Francisco?
Rick Moen and I did San Francisco.
Right. And so we had maps there, and we handed them off to everybody who was coming.
Well, we actually met at a Denny's that's just outside the Foster City limits, Foster City city limits, which meant also that it was just outside the Foster City police jurisdiction, which meant that any incidents that happened at the meeting point happened in the jurisdiction of San Mateo, and